For a long time, most people believed that history was already written. There was only one creator, perfect in justice and goodness, and everything that was known about him came from scriptures that had been passed down through generations. This view was adopted, defended, and taught as absolute truth, shaping cultures, organizing empires, and sustaining religious institutions for centuries. But what if this picture was incomplete? What if what was held sacred was only a fraction of what really happened? There are questions that insist on remaining even when silenced. For those who have always felt that there was something more, that certain pieces did not fit together properly, or that faith was built on ignored gaps, now is the time to look behind the veil. Here the ancient silence begins to unravel, revealing echoes of voices that have been silenced. If you feel that part of the truth has been forgotten, you may be in the right place to face what has been left behind. Between the forgotten centuries and the stuffy corridors of the past, thinkers emerged who dared to challenge everything that was considered indisputable. They saw another side of history, a hidden, complex layer that did not fit with the simplicity of the faith taught by religious authorities. This group, which would later be known as the Gnostics, did not bow down to official truths. On the contrary, they sought to understand what existed beyond the visible, the literal, the institutional. These seekers viewed the God presented in the Old Testament with suspicion. For them, he was not the supreme source of love and wisdom, but rather an imperfect, arrogant entity who imposed fear, punishment, and control. They questioned, investigated, and found meaning between the lines, opening space for interpretations that did not please the dominant church. After all, their proposal was not to follow blindly, but to wake up from a deep spiritual sleep. And for this boldness, they paid dearly. They were called heretics, their texts were burned, their teachings suppressed. For centuries, all that remained of their knowledge was distorted by those who accused them. However, something surprising happened in the mid-20th century. An accidental discovery by peasants in the Egyptian desert brought to light ancient manuscripts that would change the course of research on the early years of Christianity. These documents revealed a Christianity much more plural than the one officially recorded. Among them were writings that pointed to a different view of the Creator himself. According to the Gnostics, the physical world was not the work of a perfect God, but rather of a secondary entity, a limited being they called Yaldabaoth. Believing himself to be supreme, he created matter as a distorted reflection of the true spiritual world. In the eyes of the Gnostics, matter was a prison. The human soul, however, contained a divine spark, a forgotten light that needed to be rekindled. To do this, it was not enough to follow rituals or obey religious laws. True liberation would only come with inner awakening, with the recognition of one's own spiritual origin and the deception that surrounded the sensible world. This view naturally shocked the power structure of the time. Accepting that the creator of the Old Testament was a usurper and that humanity lived imprisoned by an imposed illusion was a risk to the entire theological architecture built up to that point. But behind the controversy lay a profoundly transformative proposal, the idea that the true divine is beyond form, beyond dogma, and that every being carries within itself the potential to rediscover it. The Gnostics' rejection of the biblical God was not gratuitous. They carefully observed the passages of the sacred texts and saw signs of something dissonant. A God who demands absolute obedience, who punishes entire generations for past mistakes, who prevents access to knowledge, all of this seemed inconsistent with the image of a totally good and just being. For them, this figure could not represent the supreme origin of everything. According to their teachings, Yaldabaoth was born by mistake. Sophia, a divine emanation connected to the spiritual world, had generated this being without the consent of the Pleroma. the fullness where the eons dwell. Ashamed, she tried to hide him, but he, unaware of his true origin, believed himself to be unique and began to shape the universe in his limited image. He created the heavens, the earth, and human beings, but in doing so, he unwittingly infused them with a fragment of true light. To maintain control over his creation, he surrounded himself with auxiliary entities known as archons, whose function was to reinforce the illusion of separation and ignorance. Thus humanity began to live under a veil, unable to perceive its true essence, but not all remained blind forever. Amidst the darkness, signs of liberation emerged, and one of them came in the form of Jesus. Among the manuscripts rediscovered in 1945, one in particular caught the attention, the Gospel of Judas. The text presents a radically different interpretation of the known story. According to this writing, Jesus did not come only to redeem sins, but to reveal the deception in which humanity lived. Judas, in turn, was not a traitor, but someone who understood Christ's mission and helped free him from material imprisonment. This revelation challenges centuries of dogma and forces us to reconsider what has been taught as absolute truth. It is not a matter of denying faith, but of expanding our view. History gains new layers, and what was once seen as heresy may actually contain keys to a deeper understanding of reality. This conception of an illusory creator, far from being exclusive to the Gnostics, resonated with ancient myths from other civilizations. Peoples such as the Persians and Babylonians had already formulated similar ideas, portraying the physical world as a stage for conflicting forces. In Zoroastrianism, for example, there was a clear separation between light and darkness. Ahura Mazda was associated with truth and order, while Angra Mainyu symbolized corruption and chaos, a cosmic opposition that explained the existence of evil not as the failure of a supreme god, but as the action of an adversarial spirit. This dualistic model was in many ways compatible with Gnostic thought. The idea that the visible world was formed by an inferior entity, imperfect, limited, and usurping, appeared in different forms in various cultures, suggesting that this perception spanned eras and beliefs. However, when applied to the theological structure of Christianity, it became a dangerous threat. During the 2nd century, while the Christian Church was still defining the contours of its doctrine, figures emerged who were committed to fighting this type of thinking. One of the most fervent was Irenaeus of Lyon. In his extensive work entitled Against Heresies, he vehemently denounced the Gnostics, calling their teachings pernicious distortions that corrupted the message of the apostles. For him, there was only one legitimate God, and any variation from this was seen as an evil deviation. Even in the face of repression, the dualistic view of the divine persisted. In the following centuries, it was reborn in movements such as Catharism, which flourished in the Languedoc region of medieval France. The Cathars also saw the physical world as the work of a malevolent entity and viewed salvation as an inner path, free from the impositions of the official church. Like the Gnostics, they rejected clerical authority and proposed a direct connection between humans and the divine without intermediaries. This opposition between the God of the Gospels, compassionate, welcoming and close, and the rigid, punitive and often unforgiving figure of the Old Testament, has never ceased to provoke debate. The tension between these two portraits of the sacred remains alive, raising profound questions. Were the Gnostics right to suggest that the figure presented in the Torah does not represent the true divine principle? If the world is the work of a flawed being, what is our role within this imperfect creation? Such questions were uncomfortable for the emerging church. To argue that the Creator described in the Hebrew Scriptures was not the authentic God, not only undermined the foundations of the Old Testament, but also jeopardized the theological structure that sustained early Christianity. After all, much of the Christian faith was based on the continuity between Jewish traditions and the teachings of Jesus. The Gnostic proposal was completely at odds with this. For them, true faith did not require obedience to strict rules or submission to religious leaders. Spiritual awakening was a solitary process based on the intimate discovery of hidden knowledge, gnosis. This wisdom, once accessed, freed the individual from the prison of the physical world, reconnecting them with their divine origin. This fundamental difference created a gulf between two ways of living spirituality. While Christian orthodoxy centered salvation on faith and fulfillment of the scriptures, Gnosticism valued inner search and deep understanding of hidden reality. And the more the church organized itself around a hierarchy and official rites, the more Gnostics became a real threat to its authority. In addition to Irenaeus, other theologians such as Tertullian and Hippolytus also mobilized against the Gnostics. Their criticism was not limited to doctrine. It also involved the decentralized model that Gnosticism represented. The fact that anyone, in theory, could attain gnosis without the intermediation of priests or fixed rituals made this movement even more subversive in the eyes of the religious institution. It was a reversal of the established order, a call for spiritual freedom that challenged clerical control. The unrest was so great that even prominent figures within early Christianity itself began to be viewed with suspicion. An emblematic case was that of Valentinus, a respected teacher and refined intellectual. He almost became Bishop of Rome, but his Gnostic ideas ultimately barred his rise. Nevertheless, his school, the Valentinians, left a deep mark on the theological debates of the time. Over time, the institutional response became more severe. In the following centuries, especially with the rise of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, dissent began to be stifled more intensely. Texts were banned, writings considered heretical were destroyed, and those who insisted on alternative paths were rigorously persecuted. Under Constantine's rule, orthodoxy gained status and power, and space for any other interpretation became scarce. What was once a dispute over ideas became a struggle for spiritual survival. But knowledge did not disappear. It merely went into hiding, waiting to be rediscovered. For a long time, everything that was known about the Gnostics came from opposing voices. Their beliefs survived only through distorted accounts, composed by those who most wanted to silence them. The few records that circulated were attacks from ecclesiastical figures who described the Gnostics as deceivers, spreaders of lies, and threats to the true faith. For centuries, this was the only version available, as if their ideas had never had any value. But history, every now and then, surprises us by unleashing carefully buried secrets. In 1945, an unexpected discovery in the Egyptian desert brought to light a collection of manuscripts preserved for centuries in the silence of caves and sealed urns. These texts, found in the Nag Hammadi region, shed new light on an ancient and silenced Christianity. Among the scrolls were previously unknown Gospels, writings that presented a completely different portrait of Jesus, the creation of the world, and the divine nature. Leafing through these pages revealed a Christianity focused on inner freedom and personal discovery. Instead of rigid dogmas and unquestionable hierarchies, there were invitations to awareness, intimate understanding, and the awakening of something that had always been present but hidden. The proposal was clear: abandon blind obedience and question the foundations of the world as it had been imposed. For the Gnostics, the problem lay in the very foundation of reality. They analyzed the scriptures from another perspective, carefully observing the passages in which the God described did not behave as an absolutely good and just being. Their reading was not based on the surface of the text, but on what lay behind it, in the ignored details, the contradictory actions, the commands that seemed more associated with control than with love. The account of Genesis, for example, was given a bold interpretation. The creation of man from clay and the imposition of strict rules for his stay in Eden were not seen as part of a divine plan, but as an attempt at containment. In the Gnostic view, the being who imposed such laws was not the true God, but the demiurge, a limited entity who, unaware of his own origin, believed himself to be the sole ruler of the universe. This figure, shrouded in ignorance and arrogance, had built an imperfect and imprisoned world, shaped not by love, but by a desire for domination. When he forbade Adam and Eve to eat the fruit of knowledge, he did so not out of protection, but out of fear that they would discover the truth, that they were not before the Supreme Creator, but before a usurper. Within this reinterpretation, the Serpent of Eden also took on a new role. Instead of representing evil, as Christian tradition taught, it was seen as an emissary of greater knowledge, one who came to offer humans the chance to see beyond the illusion. Eating the fruit did not mean falling into sin, but breaking the chains of imposed ignorance. Other passages from the Bible were also analyzed with this same critical eye. In Exodus, the repeated hardening of Pharaoh's heart, even when the people were suffering, raised suspicions. What would be the reason for prolonging the pain so much if the goal was to liberate? For the Gnostics, this showed a need for the demiurge to display power through suffering rather than acting with compassion and wisdom. In Deuteronomy, the orders of destruction and promises of damnation against the disobedient also seemed at odds with the image of a loving God. The same was seen in Isaiah, where jealousy and the demand for exclusive worship suggested insecurity rather than perfection. The conclusion was inevitable. This being, however powerful he might seem, did not represent the true absolute, but a malformed shadow of it. This same logic applied to the Gnostics' understanding of Jesus. For them, he did not come to confirm the ancient laws or reinforce the established system. His presence had another mission: to free souls from deception, to reveal that the world was only a veil superimposed on the truth, and that there was something much greater behind it all. Instead of aligning himself with the God of the Old Testament, Jesus exposed the flaws of this entity and pointed to a direct path to the authentic divine. Many Gnostic texts describe Jesus not as a savior in the traditional sense, but as a messenger from another plane, an awakened consciousness that came to shake humanity out of its spiritual lethargy. His role was to awaken those who were ready to see, not through external miracles, but through an understanding of who they really are and what they truly carry within themselves. The rediscovery of the writings found at Nag Hammadi offered a revealing glimpse of a long-suppressed form of Christianity. Among these texts, some Gospels presented a message profoundly different from that preached by the official church. In the Gospel of Thomas, for example, the words attributed to Jesus do not revolve around guilt or condemnation, but rather self-knowledge and spiritual awakening. He states, "If you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. If you do not, it will destroy you." This teaching clearly conveys the heart of Gnostic philosophy. Liberation does not lie in external dogmas, but in recognizing the light that dwells within each being. In the so-called Gospel of Judas, an even more provocative picture emerges. In it, Jesus departs from the traditional messianic figure and begins to instruct Judas about the true origin of the cosmos. He laughs at the disciples who still believed in the vengeful God of the Old Testament and reveals that this being was not the supreme creator, but a false god who built the physical world as a trap. Judas, often seen as a traitor, is presented in a new light, not as someone who betrayed out of greed, but as one who understood Jesus' real mission: and helped him transcend the limits of the flesh. These radical interpretations threatened to undermine the entire power structure that the church was building. The Gnostic proposal transferred the center of salvation from the temple to the individual. If each person carried within themselves a divine spark and was capable of awakening on their own, what use were rituals, priests, and intermediaries? This model of autonomous spirituality was incompatible with the rigid hierarchical organization that orthodoxy sought to consolidate. Therefore, the simple question that the Gnostics raised sounded so dangerous. What if what was accepted as revelation was, in fact, a great distortion? What if the text considered sacred was a record manipulated by entities that passed themselves off as divine? It was enough to open up this possibility for certainties to collapse. It was enough to shake the foundations of a faith built on absolute truths. In the Gnostic view, the world we live in is not the work of a perfect being, but rather the result of the error of a lesser creator. Existence, then, was not a blessing, but a prison carefully designed to keep souls asleep. This prison, however, had a flaw. An involuntary spark of divinity was left within human beings. It was precisely this forgotten spark that the Gnostics sought to awaken. The path to liberation was not through sacrifice or fearful worship, but through gnosis, a special kind of knowledge. This wisdom was not accumulated through reading or repetition, but obtained through direct experience, a silent recognition of the spiritual truth hidden beneath sensory reality. It was as if two worlds coexisted, the apparent world shaped by the demiurge and the true world inhabited by the fullness of the divine. This gnosis was not an intellectual achievement. It was an awakening of consciousness, an intimate realization that everything we had been taught about the world might be upside down. Pleasures, fears, fixed beliefs, all served as distractions. Every uncontrolled emotion, every attachment or aversion, contributed to keeping souls entangled in the web of illusion. The demiurge, with the help of the archons, had designed a system where forgetfulness was the rule and noise was constant. Even so, the Gnostic Gospels insisted on an invitation to look inward. In passages such as the Gospel of Thomas, it is clear that Jesus did not point to the sky or to sacred places. He said that the kingdom was within and outside each one of us. That it was not necessary to look far away, but rather to be silent enough to perceive. The answers would not come from outside. They were already present, dormant, waiting to be noticed. The Gospel of Truth reinforces this concept. In it, humanity is described as forgotten, immersed in distractions that distance it from its origin. The archons, representatives of the demiurge, operate through confusion. They create belief systems, fears, and suffering to keep the spark dormant. Liberation would only be possible with the removal of these layers of illusion. To this end, many Gnostics adopted practices of contemplation and simplicity. They avoided excesses not out of contempt for life, but because they knew that the soul needed silence to hear its own origin. Unlike other doctrines that condemned the body or matter, Gnostics did not believe it was necessary to deny physical experience. It was not a hatred of the flesh, but a recognition that it was not the final destination. The body was the shell, not the essence. The goal was to learn to see through it, without getting lost in the veils that the world projected. This way of thinking was directly reflected in how they saw Jesus. They did not see him as a martyr who came to die for the sins of others, but as an awakened emissary, sent not by a vengeful God, but by the true source. His mission was simple and profound, to remind humanity of what it had forgotten. He did not come to found churches or impose commandments, but to show a path invisible to the eyes, a return to the spiritual home through self-knowledge. The notion that visible reality is only an illusory layer of existence is not unique to Gnosticism. Various spiritual traditions in different parts of the world have also addressed this idea under different names and concepts. In Hinduism, for example, the word Maya is used to describe this illusion that obscures the true nature of things. According to this view, suffering arises from ignorance and attachment to what is transient, a thought that resonates deeply with Gnostic doctrine, where the material world is a deceptive creation that distances the soul from its divine origin. In Buddhism, something similar occurs. Ignorance is pointed to as the root of all suffering, and liberation is only possible through the awakening of consciousness. The reality perceived by the senses is seen as transitory, impermanent, and the path to liberation involves precisely overcoming this attachment. This principle of liberation through inner knowledge is a direct point of contact with the heart of Gnosticism, the search for gnosis, the wisdom that breaks the veil of illusion. Even after centuries of persecution and silencing, the longing for inner truth has never been extinguished. Elements of Gnostic thought have survived in a fragmented way in different esoteric movements, occult traditions, and contemporary self-knowledge practices. The idea that each individual has a divine spark within, and that this light can be accessed through a personal process of revelation, continues to touch those who feel that traditional religions do not offer complete answers. If this inner wisdom is the true path to liberation, then all structures created to keep thought under control become obstacles. Gnosticism challenges the very essence of organized religious systems, which often function as walls around spiritual experience. For Gnostics, breaking down these walls was the first step toward freedom of the soul. For a long time, what was known about these ideas came only from their detractors. Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, and Hippolytus of Rome, theologians of the early church, wrote lengthy treatises to combat the Gnostics, always portraying them as dangerous, confused, and deviant. Not only did they disapprove of their doctrines, they also encouraged the destruction of their writings. Thus, for many centuries, all that remained were distorted echoes of a profound and forgotten knowledge. However, in 1945, history took an unexpected turn. Near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a farmer stumbled upon a series of ceramic jars buried in the sand. Inside them, protected for centuries, were ancient manuscripts written in Coptic, an Egyptian dialect derived from Greek. That discovery, initially dismissed, would become one of the greatest spiritual revelations of the 20th century. In total, 52 texts were found, including Gospels, philosophical treatises, and descriptions of profound spiritual visions. Works such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, and the Apocryphon of John revealed a version of Christianity very different from that established by the councils and creeds of the official church. The focus was not on dogma, but on the transformation of consciousness. While the canonical Gospels demand faith and submission as conditions for salvation, the Gnostic texts present a Christ who guides his disciples to discover what they already carry within themselves. In the Gospel of Thomas, for example, Jesus states that whoever understands the deep meaning of his words will never experience death. This suggests that immortality is not reserved for the obedient, but for the awakened, those who realize what they truly are. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most emblematic writings in this collection, delves into Gnostic cosmology, explaining the origin of the universe as a consequence of an imbalance. Sophia, a divine entity linked to the spiritual realm, makes a mistake and gives rise to the demiurge, who, unaware of his origins, creates the material world. From that act onwards, the human soul lives imprisoned in a fragmented universe, disconnected from its true source. Liberation, in this context, is not a gift granted, but an internal process of remembrance. Another revealing text is the Gospel of Judas, rediscovered separately in the 1970s, but which shares affinities with the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. In it, Judas is not the traditional villain, but the disciple who truly understands Jesus. He acts not out of betrayal, but out of loyalty to a higher plan, helping Christ to free himself from the physical body. The crucifixion, therefore, is not martyrdom, but a return to the origin, far from the bonds imposed by the demiurge. The importance of these texts transcends their spiritual content. They reconfigure our understanding of the early centuries of Christianity, revealing a plurality of thoughts and practices that have been systematically erased from official history. The discovery of Nag Hammadi dismantles the idea that there has always been only one authentic Christian doctrine. On the contrary, it shows that Christianity was born as a diverse, contested field, full of nuances and conflicting views. The traditional view, which painted the Gnostics as an isolated and marginal group, had to be revised. The manuscripts reveal a rich, complex, and incredibly well-articulated theology. The Gnostics were not just disorganized mystics, but sophisticated thinkers with a coherent cosmology and a profound critique of the religious authority of the time. The repression they suffered was so intense that were it not for these hidden manuscripts, we might never have known how much they influenced the spiritual imagination of humanity. It was as if they had foreseen that their words would be persecuted, and therefore kept them not for their contemporaries, but for future times when they could finally be understood. The publication of these documents in the second half of the 20th century sparked a wave of debate. Theologians, philosophers, and scholars began to re-evaluate the foundations of Christianity. Many were faced with a choice: continue to accept the single, official version, or consider that the history of faith is much broader, more complex, and full of possibilities. Today, Gnosticism arouses interest not only as a historical curiosity, but as a living alternative to institutionalized spirituality. In a world increasingly saturated by ready-made formulas, unquestionable dogmas, and authoritarian religious leaders, the proposal of a personal path of inner discovery echoes strongly once again. Gnosis, once buried, returns as a subtle call to those who still believe that there is more to be seen beyond forms and symbols. If the Nag Hammadi manuscripts had not been found, one of the most profound and enigmatic chapters of human spirituality would have remained lost. But truth has a strange habit of resurfacing, even after centuries of silence.